join us today. This event is hosted by the Eritrean Assistance Organization in Chicago, EAOC. As you know, information these days is the new gold. So to have better understanding about addiction, we invited Dr. Masiha just to share his knowledge and work experience and experts with us. It's a blessing, to have a professionals like you. Thank you so much. So thank you for your willingness to share your valuable information that can benefit our community. Just to give you an idea about Dr. Masiha, Dr. Tony Masiha, he completed his residence at Mount Sinai here in Chicago. He is a board certified family medicine physician, currently practicing at as an inpatient hospitalist. So now please join me in welcoming him, and then it's yours. When you have any questions, you can raise your hand, unmute yourself, and then you can ask him while he was presenting, or you can also send your questions through the chat. And the best one is also you can ask your questions maybe at the end of his presentation. So it's yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the intro. Yeah, so as you mentioned, I'm Dr. Masiha, family medicine trained. I do see a lot of addiction in my practice. I primarily work in a hospital setting, but the setting that I typically see people is either in the psych ward or when I'm working with people in the ICU if they're going through withdrawals for any reason. So I see this on a regular daily basis. But the addiction is such a wide topic, and there's so many things that we could discuss. So there's a lot I want to get through, and I might go a little quickly. So if you feel like I'm going a little too quick, feel free to slow me down. Feel free to stop me if you have any questions. Otherwise, we're going to just blitz through it. A lot of the spiritual takes and things that we're going to talk about spiritually are going to kind of come towards the end. So if you have spiritual questions, I would just kind of hold off until the very end. Can everyone see my screen? The screen is okay?
Yes, we can see it.
Yes. Perfect. Okay, just wanted to make sure. Alrighty, so we can begin. So this is the mental health talk. We did a series over at the Coptic Orthodox Church a few months ago. So this was a similar presentation that I gave then. So there's going to be a lot of similarities. I made some tweaks and some changes based on the feedback that I received from that talk. So I'll get started here. This is just the contents and what direction we're going to go with the talk. And I started off with the National Helpline for substance abuse. So if anybody ever has any concerns themselves or family members, I think we got to mute someone here. But if you ever have any concerns or issues, feel free to call this number. They're available 24/7, all day, every day. So this is a good place to get some resources. All right. And as I mentioned, I am a physician, but I am not your physician. So please do not use anything we're going to talk about today as medical advice. This is not an excuse to diagnose yourself or others. This is purely just for informational purposes and demystifying this concept of addiction and mental health and just kind of having these open conversations. So again, please see your primary or your mental health experts before making any conclusions from this talk. Alrighty, so we're going to start off with the definition of addiction, and this is a fairly contested subject in terms of what we actually classify as an addiction. Depending which angle you take it from and who you ask, you might get a little bit of a different definition. So how I geared this talk is kind of around this definition that I use and how I was trained and how most, I think, people in the medical and mental health field tend to treat addiction or define it, I should say. So this is the definition that I have come to and the one I'm going to present here and will use for our purposes. So I'm just going to read it out and then we'll break it down. So the first, the sentence here is urge to act or use something that interferes with your functioning in other areas of your life. I'm going to repeat it again because it's really important and it's going to come up a lot during this talk. The urge to act or use something that interferes with your functioning in other areas of your life. So we'll start off with the first bit here, the urge to act. Keyword is urge. So not actually acting, but just the urge could put somebody in the category of an addiction. So the example I'll give is, the first topic we're going to talk about is alcohol. So I'm going to use that for this example. If somebody is drinking, if somebody is not able to focus on this talk because all they could think about is their wine tonight or their beer or vodka, whatever it may be, and they haven't actually had a drink, that could be considered just the urge, could be considered an addiction. Following that sentence here, we say that you're good if it interferes with functioning in other areas of your life. So if that urge is impacting your day-to-day life in any way, that could be considered an addiction as well. So the example I'll give is if somebody is drinking 5 shots of vodka in a day and they're still able to do their day-to-day life, take care of their family, go to work, they're about to get a promotion, paying the mortgage, that would not fall in line with our definition of addiction, even though they're drinking a significant amount of alcohol. But on the opposite side, if somebody's drinking 2 to 3 shots in a day and they are stuck at the bar till 5 a.m., late for work, they can't take care of their family, can't pay their mortgage, can't do the day-to-day basics, or the goals of their day to meet success or whatever they consider success, then that would be considered more in line with our definition of addiction. So the point is, there's no hard cutoffs, there's no number, there's no guidelines, there's no if X then Y. It's a bit subjective, and ultimately, if you meet the category of you have this urge, it's affecting your life, that's something that could be classified as an addiction. All right. So we're going to start off by talking about the risk factors for developing an addiction. And right off the bat, we're going to talk a little bit about nature versus nurture. People always say, I have an addiction gene or addiction runs in my family. And there is a little bit of truth to that. Genetically, there is a predisposition for people who have addiction in the family. They're more likely to develop addiction as well. So that is something to be mindful of. But by no means does that destine anybody to become addicted to something. It just means you're slightly more inclined. And this isn't a very strong correlation. We haven't found any definitive genes or addiction gene that exists. It's very multifactorial. There's many factors that go into it, and it's an increase, but not necessarily destining anybody to develop an addiction just because your family member or immediate family is addicted to something. Similarly, learned behavior. If somebody is in a household where alcohol is the first thing that your family member will go to when they're coping with a problem, or if it's accessible in your fridge, those are all things that can help increase the likelihood of you developing learned behavior, i.e. following what other people around you were doing when you were young. Other mental health disorders are also a big indication or risk factor for developing an addiction. ADHD being one of the big ones. It's a compulsive disease, and compulsion means lower threshold for doing things, and ultimately more likely to try or use an array of substances or some other forms of addiction. So we know that people who have ADHD in the history in their lifespan have a 50% chance of using some sort of substance, primarily illicit substances is what we're referring to here. So they are at increased risk of developing addiction. Similarly, depression. If you're depressed chronically, you probably have difficulty experiencing euphoria, or you're just always feeling down, in which case you may turn to substances to try to cope or combat that. And other mental health disorders also, but these are the two big ones, ADHD and depression. Of course, poverty, violence, being exposed to these are big factors for developing an addiction. We're not going to get into that one too much. And the last one, and if you remember nothing else from the slide, this is the one I hope we remember for this talk, is the most important or the most consistent predictor for developing an addiction is the age of first use. So if somebody, the way I explain it is if you have a 4-year-old and you're trying to teach them a new language, it's much easier than say when they're 18, and much easier to learn a new language when you're 4 than when you're 40. So as we get older, it becomes harder and harder to learn new things. Our brains are still molding and changing when we're young. The biochemistry is changing, and that's why things tend to stick when you're young, which can be a good thing if you're learning a language, but a bad thing if you're trying or doing addictive things because it's easier to stick. So that's why we say we have to be very careful with the younger population, people below the age of 18, 21, because this is when they're most vulnerable and when they have the most ability to stick to something. So we need to be careful with what we're exposing them to. Alrighty. So that was a bit of the intro in terms of what we're going to talk about, risk factors. Now we're going to break down into the different types of addictions that we're going to talk about today. I get into some topics more than others. There are a lot of topics. Again, it's just so vast, and there's so many things I wish I could talk about. So I might not hit everything, and I apologize, but I hope at least it gives you a good framework of what we're dealing with when we're talking about addiction. So like I said, the first one we're going to talk about here is alcohol. the reason I started off with this one is because it's probably the most well understood of all addictions. This is a very objective substance that we can talk about, and effectively, when we're talking about alcohol, it is a chemical, and we know exactly what receptor the chemical is working on in the brain. We know exactly how it's going to affect you. We know the dose equals X, Y, Z. So it's something that we can very easily quantify, and it makes it very easy to talk about and can translate into the next steps and the next things we're going to talk about. So alcohol is considered a depressant. So when we're talking about depressants, we're talking about things that decrease the brain activity, things that slow you down. The way I describe it is it's like turning off all the lights at home. You're bringing everything down, cooling it down, and ultimately it's called a depressant. That's not the same thing as being depressed. That's a very different thing. This is saying that the activity, the voltage in the brain is going down. So you can see things like decreased anxiety, impaired coordination, impaired cognitive function, bringing things down. Typically, when we hear about people who may drink alcohol in social settings, they say that it increases their confidence, but this isn't really confidence. This is really just decreasing their threshold for saying things. If they're anxious, they don't want to say something because their boss is sitting next to them, whatever reason, that brings that anxiety down and makes them more likely to say things that they normally wouldn't say. So it really is just bringing down and dampening the whole system. So I'm going to show you guys some graphs. If you're not good with graphs, don't stress about this. This is really just to drive home a point. So if you're not good with graphs, don't stress. So when we're having this conversation and you guys are following along, hopefully we're following along. You have this line here. I don't know if you can see my mouse. No, I don't think you can. We have this line in the middle here that says normal. This is brain activity. Normal being that center line. This is the conversation that we're having. It's the wavelength that we're speaking right now. If you were to take a substance or do something that would increase its brain activity, it can either go up or down, either excitatory being going up or a depressant going down. So if somebody were to drink alcohol, we would expect that their brain activity would go up or down. Hopefully you're thinking down because alcohol is a depressant. So this actually brings down your brain activity like we talked about, and ultimately your brain activity will be inhibited or depressed. And this might be the intended effect. This might be what people need in that social setting or whatever it may be. This becomes a medical problem or a social problem when this becomes a chronic issue. So if somebody's drinking alcohol every single day, every other day, and it becomes a habitual pattern and an excessive amount, then the brain begins to adapt. It starts to see that your brain is always inhibited or depressed, and your body and your brain don't like that. So what it tries to do is it tries to counteract this. It changes your biochemistry, it changes your receptors, it makes a lot of changes in your brain to counter this out. And the way I describe it is if I were to give you a medication that would bring down your body temperature, your body doesn't want to be cold, it will bring up your temperature to counteract it. If I gave you something that cools down your temperature, if I give you something that increases your body temperature, your body doesn't want to be warm, it'll change the biochemistry to bring down your temperature to ultimately keep you at this normal level. So that's all to say that what your body's going to do is it's going to change your baseline to excitatory. It's going to increase the voltage in your brain. It's going to turn up the lights. So it's anticipating when you turn down some lights, it's going to get some more alcohol tonight. It's going to be at that normal line. So this works fine if you do drink alcohol and it becomes a habitual pattern, aside from the fact that you're doing some issues with your liver and all sorts of other body issues, but brain activity wise, it equals out. The problem is if and when you decide to quit or stop drinking, what happens is we find that your body is at this brain activity of excitatory. This is your baseline now, your new baseline. And this doesn't fix itself or correct itself just because you told your brain that I'm not going to drink tonight. This is your baseline. And this baseline can take months to correct back to a normal baseline. So what we find is that when people stop drinking abruptly, they end up being in this excitatory line. What does that mean? That means you can come with sweating, you can be very agitated, anxious, very, very, very hyperactive. In extreme cases, you see hallucinations. People begin to hallucinate, and ultimately, this can lead to death. So this is a very, very big realization that addictions can kill you, withdrawals can kill you. And this is biochemistry in your brain that is changing with addiction. This isn't just a social issue. This isn't a psych issue in the sense of psychosocial problems or behavioral problems. This is your biochemistry. This is your morphology that's changing with addiction. It's a very difficult thing to manage and treat and resolve. So this is the takeaway point from this slide and this concept is when we're talking about addiction with ourselves or loved ones or people in our community, it's not as simple as just saying, just quit, just stop. I can do it. You can do it. I don't drink, therefore you don't need to drink. This is something that is very difficult and has a biochemistry impact on top of the psychosocial components and habit forming and all those things. This is a very difficult thing to manage and deal with. And we'll see a little bit more of that as we go through the talk. All right. Are there any questions about that? I know that might be a lot of visuals. If not, I'll keep going. Alrighty. So we're going to talk a little bit about illicit substances, and there's a lot of overlap because you could argue that alcohol is technically a substance, but this is more about the illicit substances that we're going to talk about now. So we're going to talk a little bit about some medications you guys may or may not be familiar with. If you've heard of benzodiazepines, aka Xanax, you might have heard of that. People take that for their anxiety just to chill out a little bit. Some other medications like barbiturates, pain medications. These are the depressants. They bring you down, very similar to alcohol. They decrease your anxiety, impaired coordination, impaired cognitive function. They bring things down. So if I ever see a patient in the ICU that I'm dealing with, and this is a daily occurrence, if not at least a couple a week that I see somebody in ICU that's coming in with alcohol withdrawals, and I want to bring them back to their normal baseline, I give them these medications. I give them the benzos, the barbiturates, because I want to bring them back down to their normal baseline while their body slowly adapts. So we use these medications to counteract hyperactivity. The opposite can be true as well. You can have stimulants like cocaine, methamphetamines, PCP, increase excitement, heightened sense of well-being, increase alertness. These are the types of people that you see running down naked in the street, flipping cars and cussing out the cops. And we see this a lot too in the hospital, unfortunately, but the same is true of the opposite. So you can have a stimulant that increases your excitatory pathways in the brain, and ultimately your brain is going to do the opposite. Like we said, it wants to be at that normal baseline. So what it's going to do is it's going to change your baseline to inhibited or depressed. Again, this is assuming you use it chronically. And ultimately your brain activity goes back to normal to counteract. It counteracts the stimulant to reach a normal baseline. All right. Any questions about that? All right. This next topic we're going to talk about is the opioid crisis. I actually have a video that I want to share with you guys. It was a TED Talk on YouTube that I thought was really good. And it drives home all the points I wanted to make better than I could have said them with some really good visuals. So I'm going to see if the video plays. Hopefully it works. If not, I'll just summarize. But there's a lot of science and a lot of moving parts in this 2-minute video. So if the science is kind of going over your head, it's not really that important. It's more about the final takeaway points. So we'll summarize at the end if it's kind of a little too specific. Can you guys see my screen here? Yes. Okay, hopefully the audio works.
Yeah, yes, we can see it. It works.
Perfect. I'm gonna see if the audio works. Can you hear that?
No, we can't hear it. Oh, it's coming now. It's coming. Okay.
So sorry, say that again.
Yes, we can hear it. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, you can hear it? Okay, perfect.
Yeah. Oh, maybe the volume is somehow I can't hear it on my side.
Say it again, sorry.
I can't hear it on my side. I don't.
Can't hear it. Let me try. If I put the closed caption, will that be better? So we can at least read along.
Okay.
Or alternatively, if everybody wants to just open the link, is that easier? If I just I'm trying to think how to do this best.
Yeah, maybe you can send to us or
Yeah, and then everyone can watch it at the same time, and then we'll talk about it. We'll take like a 2-minute break, watch the video, and then we'll talk about it. That might be the best move. So I'm gonna send this video into the chat. Okay, so everyone can open the chat, and then we're going to watch minute 139 to 521.
Everybody in studio, how you doing out there? Oh, it's funny to ask people how you're doing when the world's so crazy right now.
Morphine, codeine, and other substances made directly from the poppy are called opiates. In the 20th century, drug companies created a slew of synthetic substances similar to these opiates,
There's
including
somebody watching the wrong time, so I'm just gonna
and
post the
fentanyl.
time.
Whether synthetic or derived from opium, these compounds are collectively known as opioids. Synthetic or natural, legal or illicit,
All right, I think we gave it about 3 minutes. Is everybody done the video? Are we wrapping up?
Okay.
Are we ready for are we done the video?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay.
You already sent us the link, so I should be able to see it later. And then if you
Yeah.
can summarize the main points of it, I think that'll be more than
Yeah,
enough.
absolutely.
Thank you.
So the timestamps were posted in the chat. It's between 139 to I think it was 512, 521, and the video is right here, the opioid crisis TED Talk. If you just Google that, you'll be able to find it. So ultimately, what we saw in that video is a few things, a few takeaways. So we know that opioids are very powerful. They bind very strongly to receptors. They're a very difficult thing to deal with and to manage. But ultimately, the main takeaway I hope you got from that at the end of that video was the part where they mentioned that most people who are using opioids are not using opioids because they want to get high or want to get the positive effects that are typically associated with opioids. Most people that are using it to combat the negativity and the difficulty of the withdrawal symptoms. So for example, if you were paying close attention to some of the symptoms, they mentioned things like diarrhea, nausea, feeling unwell. People that are withdrawing or people that stop taking opioids abruptly can get very sick. They have multiple bouts of diarrhea, maybe 16 times, right? And something that I grew up in my community hearing, and I don't know if you guys are similar, but I think we have a lot of similar overlaps, so I'm willing to bet that there are some similarities there. But something that I heard growing up in my community was comments like, don't give people who could be perceived as drug addicts, i.e. homeless people, don't give them money because they're just going to go out and buy drugs, right? That's something that I've heard before. And I think it comes from a really good place, which is we don't want to enable people. We don't want to be the reason why somebody's doing what we perceive as a mistake. But at the same time, if somebody's trying to just get by with their lives and do their day-to-day living, or if they're trying to get a job interview, that becomes effectively impossible if you have 16 bouts of diarrhea in a day. You can't get through an interview, right? You can't go about your day-to-day life. So at some point, this becomes necessary for you to end up going on with your day, which is why the majority of people who are using are not people who are looking for the benefits or the positive effects, but they're looking for a way to manage their day-to-day to keep them at that net zero. Interestingly, many people don't know this, but when people who are struggling with opioid withdrawals see a primary doctor or psychiatrist, whoever it may be, typically what we prescribe are medications that are opioids, things that are very similar to opioids, work on the same receptors, things that are equivalent or work on those same receptors to get similar effects so that they can go about their day. And some people are on this medication or these medications for weeks, months, and even lifelong years. People may need to be on opioids indefinitely. So it's just a little bit of grace and a little bit of tweaking when we're talking about these issues with our families and our friends and our community, that this is a really difficult thing that we're dealing with. And with all addictions, there's no just stop, just don't do it, just don't buy the medication, don't buy the drugs. That's not really an option for most people. All right. And that was the medical side of things, but there's also the economical side, which I thought was really interesting. I know we've all probably heard of the opioid crisis before, but this is a really big economic toll. Nearly $1.5 trillion in the year 2020 economic toll. That's a lot of money. To put into perspective, the U.S. military budget spending was $700 billion in that year, which is half of this number. And that's not saying that we spent 1.5 trillion. That's just saying that we lost, or the impact of it was 1.5 trillion, which I think is substantial, but not that surprising considering that myself and probably most healthcare workers see this on a daily basis, sometimes back-to-back patients, where it's one person who's dealing with a heroin addiction, and the very next room, it's a suburban soccer mom who is hooked on her narcos that she took because she broke her leg 3 years ago. So it's a very prominent thing. And actually, we're seeing illicit substance use, i.e. heroin use, is actually on the decline. It's not those medications or those drugs that we're seeing more of. What we're seeing more of is the synthetic opioids, things that are prescribed, the morphine, things you get in the hospital, the fentanyl patches. Those type of things are the things that are on the rise. And that's why we're exponentially going up, not because of the stereotypical heroin addict on the corner of the street. But by the way, that's just my my food for thought. And on that transition, it's a little hard to relate to some people. It might be hard to relate to opioids and cocaine and those more difficult topics. But I think something we can all relate to is food. Food is something that we all eat 2 to 3 times a day, if not more, and it's something that we all experience. So I will pose a question for you guys, which I think is an interesting talk here. Do you think you can be addicted to food? So this is a bit of a interesting discussion that maybe I don't know if we can break into small groups with the way the format is set up with the audio, but maybe we can just take maybe 2 minutes to just kind of think it out, and then I will touch base in a minute or two after you guys think about it or discuss it with your family members that might be next to you, and then we'll just either share some thoughts or I'll give you what my thoughts are on the subject, and we'll go from there. So I'll give you guys a minute or two here, and then I'll just pop back in. All right. I will interrupt a little here because we still have a long way to go. So does anyone want to share their thoughts or answer to this question? If not, that's fine. I'll just give you my thoughts. But anybody have any strong thoughts? If it's just a yes or no. If it's an
Yeah,
explanation,
there are
go ahead.
some people that are saying yeah, yes and no on when you check the chat.
Oh, yeah,
And then Razan also put, he said yes, and then eating disorder.
sort of great. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's a lot of accuracy there. So this is a very contested subject in the medical field, and this is gonna be the transition point for our talk, where things are gonna be a little bit more subjective. So everything we talked about up until this point is very concrete, right? I can tell you exactly which dose of which substance can affect which receptor in the brain, and it's very objective. But now we're transitioning to the more subjective part, which is I don't have a cheeseburger receptor, right? I don't have Coca-Cola and fries receptor. It just doesn't exist. So this becomes a little more contentious. So the community is a little split. The medical community is a little bit split in terms of the answer to this question. Some people say, yes, of course, it is considered an addiction. You can get addicted to it, just like anything, because we tend to see the same patterns and habits forming in food overuse or eating disorders as we do see in addiction for other substances. People do the same patterns, same difficulties, the same struggles. But the opposite side being, of course, that we don't have those receptors, and therefore it's hard to classify it as an addiction because it doesn't really qualify based on our definitions. And ultimately, what it is it's more in line with compulsive disorders, i.e., eating disorders, like someone mentioned. So it's a bit of a nuance, and for our purposes, it doesn't matter too much. But to be accurate, there's no formal diagnosis of a food addiction yet. But also keep in mind that the patterns and the difficulties are very similar. I would make the argument though that you can be addicted to stimulants that are in your food or substances that are in your food. Let's not get that confused. So, for example, if I were to put cocaine in your coffee, you can still get addicted to cocaine, right? That doesn't mean that substances aren't still something that can be addictive. So similarly, caffeine, right? Caffeine is also a stimulant that we put in our drinks. It causes increased excitement, heightened sense of well-being, increased alertness. The exact same points I put for the cocaine, the methamphetamines, those stimulants. So I think this is a very interesting comparison to some of the other stimulants that we talked about. But something that's even more interesting is you guys may or may not know this. Did you guys know that? You always hear the rumor, but this is actually there's some truth to it. That there was cocaine that they used to put in Coca-Cola, and it was marketed as something that was meant to clear the sinuses, decrease headaches, and cocaine was effectively over the counter back in the 1900s, however long ago that was. But now we obviously know better. We know that, of course, there are a lot of side effects, and we obviously don't have cocaine over the counter anymore. But I would argue that we actually have something that is similar or not worse, if not worse, than cocaine in our Coke now, and that is sugar. Sugar is terrible for you medically, and I'm gonna pose another thought, and this by no means is definitive. This is not an objective medical take. This is more of a interesting thought that I came across. Again, sugar is another one that's fairly contentious, much like food. There's no clear decision being made by the medical community if you can or can't be technically addicted to sugar. But a lot of the patterns that we're seeing with people who struggle with increased intakes of sugar or habitual sugar intakes are very similar to the patterns that we see of people who are addicted to other substances. So this is an interesting image that I want to share. There's 3 brain MRIs here, so medical imaging that we do of the brain. And this isn't a definitive study. This is more of just an interesting image that I thought was cool and I wanted to share. But by no means is this making a conclusive decision or statement. So the first image here is a normal brain, and we can see 3 very clear colors. You can see high dopamine, low dopamine, and medium dopamine. So we got the red, the yellow, the green. They're very clear. So in the normal brain, we can see some fluctuations in our dopamine, which is a good thing. We want fluctuations. We want to experience good day-to-day living. We want to experience laughter. You hear a funny joke. You eat some food that you like. You spend time with your family. You cuddle with your dog. These are good things. We want fluctuations in dopamine. But if we look at the second image, we see just mostly green, maybe some yellow. We don't see much of those high dopamine fluctuations. And this is seen in a cocaine user. And I would argue, I don't know if this is accurate or not, but I would argue that the only thing, or one of the few things that would get this person to have that high dopamine level is another hit of cocaine, because their brain is effectively blunted and they are unable to experience that positive pleasure because of the habitual cocaine use. Similarly, we have a third image, which is a sugar user, and it looks very similar to the cocaine user. So, we all probably have sugar in some way or form, and any processed foods is almost impossible to get away from nowadays. But we're talking about habitual users, people who are using excessive amounts of sugar in their diet. And you can see that there's low, maybe even less medium in terms of their dopamine fluctuations, which I thought was really interesting. Again, this isn't me stating that sugar addiction is objective or factual, but there are a lot of patterns that we see with other substances. So just thought, but at the end of the day, sugar is terrible for you, for your body. So if you can avoid it, probably a good idea, or minimize it, I should say. All right. So this is another really big topic, technology. There's so many things I could talk about here. So I just picked a couple of good points that I thought were relevant, and we'll just start off with the one that everyone probably assumed is coming, which is your phone addiction. It's a really big problem, and socially I see it a lot with my group of friends and my peers, and especially in the younger population. I feel like I've been seeing more and more of, I can't remember the last time I'll save that story for a little bit later. But there was a study that was done for what we're going to call phone addiction, but again, with these subjective ones, there's no formal diagnosis for a phone addiction. It's more subjective, and there was a study that was done in Delhi, India, where they said, if phone addiction were an accurate diagnosis, if we use the same parameters that we use for other addictions, how many people, or how prevalent would addiction be considered in this adolescent Indian population, so high school age. So they use this criteria that we use for other addictions, and they just kind of translated it. And ultimately, what they found was about a third of adolescents were addicted to their phones, which I think, at least in our community, is probably more. And I think some parents can attest to that. But it's just something that I thought was really interesting. So my anecdotal story is that I have a friend. I grew up in Canada, and my friend back home in Canada has he's a teacher, and he has a class where he teaches high school students, or he teaches high school in general. And he's found that he can't get through a class without taking a couple minute breaks for students to check their phone, because they just don't have the attention span or the ability to really sit through an entire talk. So he would do like 15, 20 minutes of lecture or talk, and then a couple minute phone break, which I thought was really interesting. And we didn't have that back in my day, but just something that's interesting. It's very pervasive in our communities, and something just to be aware of. This is my, yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Tony, just before you go, there is a question related to the sugar. Helen
Oh,
asked
sure. Is
on
there a
the
quantity
chat.
what is a high and yeah, so there's no, like I said, it's not really a hard set rule. It wasn't a really formal study. There was no real cutoffs. It was really just a general image of like one person that they checked. So I don't know what the exact cutoffs are. It's not, please don't take it out of context. There's no hard numbers. There's no set number to be considered a habitual sugar user, because like I said, everybody takes sugar at some level, whether it be in your coffee or in processed foods, or there's sugar in your fruits and vegetables. So I don't know if there's a hard cutoff to be in that third category, but I wouldn't stress about it. I don't think, if you have a normal diet like you and I do, you're probably not going to be in that right side. You'll probably be more on the left side, because the normal brain is your day-to-day person who isn't using it habitually. But I don't know the exact cutoff for that right-sided brain, but that is a good question, and that's why I'm always nervous to show that picture, because people really like it and they like to use it to say that this is bad, and therefore, no, it's really just for example's sake and just an illustration of a point that I'm trying to make. But I don't really know the hard cutoff, so I don't know if that answered your question, but let's keep going. Okay. So the next topic I'm going to talk about is video games. And I thought this was just my personal experience, and I thought it was just going to be for me, and no one was really going to be very engaged in this one. But when I gave the same talk to the Coptic Orthodox community a few months back, this is the thing that I got the most questions about, and a lot of concerned parents and a lot of concerned family members. So I'm going to get a little bit more into it this time. I am a very avid video game player, so this is my personal my personal soapbox here. So again, with these behavioral habitual patterns, we don't really have a formal diagnosis in terms of addiction. So we don't have a video game addiction. That doesn't exist in our nomenclature. Maybe it will in the future. But right now, what we do have is something called video game disorder. I'm going to skim through the definition here, or the classification, the diagnosis essentially. But you're going to see a lot of overlap and patterns with what we defined as our addiction, our definition of addiction. So characterized by impaired control over gaming, increased priority. So that's like that first half of our definition, the urge to do something. And then if we skip to the end here, despite the occurrence of negative consequences, i.e. Affecting your life, which is very similar to the definition we gave for addiction. But again, we can't properly diagnose or formally diagnose somebody with a video game addiction because at this point in time, it just doesn't exist. But again, it follows very similar patterns and rules to addiction that we've talked about. So the urge to do something coupled with the negative impacts on your day-to-day life. And the example I like to give, my parents used to always scold me and say I'm addicted to video games. So this might, again, just be my personal vendetta when I make this example. But when we're talking about our loved ones or family members or our grandma who's on Candy Crush for 10 hours a day, we have to be careful with our words. When we're saying that somebody is possibly addicted to their phones or video games, it's not a time number. It's not a hard number. It's not 14 hours equals addiction, right? We have to look at their impulses, their ability to control their urges, and then also how is it impacting their life. So if somebody can still go to volleyball practice, get an A+ on all their tests, and go and hang out with their peers outside of the house, and then they come home and they play 4 hours in a day, that, for our definition, wouldn't really constitute what we're saying is similar to an addiction. But the opposite is true as well, which is if somebody is not doing well in school, all they can think about is going home to play video games, and they're not going to their swimming practice, and they're not going to church on Sunday morning, but they only end up playing an hour or two, then that would be considered more in line with this video game disorder, or more in line with what we typically consider an addiction. That, again, is a bit of a contentious topic, though, but just be careful with our words. And by no means am I saying if you play 10 hours a day that means that it's okay. You're still not probably using your time very effectively, but that's a different issue. All right. This is the one that is going to break a bit of the rules that I've been kind of setting. We said behavioral issues or patterns are not formally diagnosed as an addiction. This is the one exception. Gambling. It might just be the timeline of gambling. We've known about it for much longer versus something like video games or phones are still a new and up and coming thing. But because for whatever reason the medical community has decided, they have deemed this an addiction. This is under the category of an addiction, gambling. So again, I'll skim through this definition here. Preoccupation of gambling, so that urge, blah, blah, blah. And then ultimately lying, stealing, losing significant relationships, jobs, or educational opportunities. So it can't be considered an addiction or gambling if you're not actually impacting your life. So it's not a monetary value. It has to be that urge followed by that impact on your day-to-day life. So I'm going to pose a question to you guys if you want to just answer in the chat or if you want to just speak up. Do you guys remember what the #1 risk factor or the predisposing factor for developing an addiction was? This goes back to the beginning of the talk. Anyone remember the one thing I said to remember? Okay, I got an answer here. Age of onset. Beautiful. Yep, we got it. So age of onset. The younger you start, the more malleable you are, the more likely you to pick up good and bad habits. So that's why we're so strict about gambling, right? We say 21 plus for the casinos or for any lottery tickets or whatever it may be, depending on what state you're in, but for the most part, 21. And people tend to think that we have a really good handle on this and we're preventing children or people under that age to gamble. And again, this is a bit of my soapbox here, but very, very, unfortunately, a lot of things slip through. So if you guys may have heard of this, these loot boxes or these loot crates in video games. It's in every single video game essentially at this point. And what it is it's basically you take US currency or financial currency transmit it to video game dollars, or kids may have asked you to buy V-Bucks or whatever it may be, and they use that virtual currency to buy these crates. And these crates are essentially just a random array of stuff that that you may already have. So if you have like a hat or something in the game, it might give you the same hat, so you don't really need it. It might be something that is not as valuable as the crate you purchased if you just bought it outright, or it might be something that's more valuable than the crate that you purchased that you didn't particularly plan for. But this kind of sounds like gambling because it effectively is gambling, and this is open to everybody, anyone age 3+. Anyone can access this as long as you have some sort of financial currency. So this is something that's been lobbied a lot in different countries. The US is in the grounds and has started up in terms of banning this in video games. The EU has gotten a little further than we have, but this is something that is in every game that our children are playing, that our grandparents are playing. And this is something just to be aware of and mindful of, that there are many different avenues for gambling to trickle in, and it's very important that we protect people who are at their most vulnerable when they're young and can't make those effective decisions, and they're still very vulnerable to pick up these good and bad habits. I think that's all I want to say, but loot crates alone generated more than 15 billion globally, so they are very prominent and something to be mindful of when you're giving your children virtual currency or money for Fortnite or whatever it is. Not to say that that is or isn't good parenting, but just be present when your children are, or your grandparent is purchasing virtual goods. Be around, just make sure that they're buying the thing that they intend to buy, and that they're not just rolling through crates or doing something that is similar to gambling. All right. Relationships, I'm not going to get too much into this one. We actually had a talk over at the Coptic Orthodox Church again about relationships a couple weeks before I gave this talk. So there are some links that we can provide if anyone's interested specifically in this topic, but I don't get really into it. But one thing that I do talk about when we're talking about relationships is this concept of porn, or this concept of sex addiction, right? We hear this all the time, and it's very inaccurate. There's no concept, there's no definition of porn addiction, or there's no definition of a sex addiction. That just doesn't exist, at least at this time. But again, very similar patterns. This is more of a compulsive disorder, and there are nuances between a compulsive and an addiction, but it doesn't really matter for our purposes. There's a lot of similar overlap as well. So again, just skimming through it: pattern, a failure to control intense sexual impulses or urges. The urges, again, and the second half we know is coming. Personal, family, social, educational impacts on your day-to-day life, right? So very similar. This is something that is very commonly seen, or not commonly, but it is seen in our clinics and our hospitals, something that people struggle with. So again, if you ever have issues or concerns between yourself or loved ones, please feel free to reach out to your primary doctor or your mental health experts, and they can help you out with this. But again, be careful with our words and how we define things or how we accuse or state things. All right, so that was a lot of difficult conversation, a lot of harsh and very tough things to talk about. But now we're going to get into the recovery, so a little bit more of the positive side. But let's get started here with the steps in terms of recovery and how to actually move through these steps. So you guys may have heard of the stages of grief, the anger and all that, and then ultimately the resolution at the end. With addiction, it's a little different. We don't really go in this linear pattern as it seems to imply on this picture. It's more of a cycle. You tend to go from maintenance back to pre-contemplation, and you kind of just go in a big circle. And that's a testament to how difficult treating and resolving an addiction is. It really is a multi-month, multi-year, and many times lifelong battle. And it's something that people ultimately don't necessarily just get over, like to sometimes say, or when we're not being as supportive as we should be. It's something that people struggle with, sometimes lifelong. And the example I like to give is smokers, people who are addicted to nicotine. People who attempt to quit smoking statistically are only lifelong successful 7% of the time. And that's not to say that you shouldn't attempt to quit, because you still get all the benefits of not smoking for that week or that month or for however long you don't. And that's not to say that you shouldn't keep trying, because it's 7% per attempt. So if you try 10 times, maybe one of them sticks. But that's just a testament to how difficult it is to really get off this cycle. So I'll go through them really briefly with the example of smoking in mind, pre-contemplation. So that's before you contemplate something, the initial thoughts. So you are if you are talking to your physician and I were to tell you, do you smoke cigarettes or how many cigarettes do you smoke? And you say, I smoke a pack a day. And I were to say, how do you feel about that? Your answer might be, oh, I don't see a problem with it. My grandmother, she lived till she was 95. She never had any issues. So I don't see a problem with it, right? That might be somebody who's in the pre-contemplation stage before they even consider change. Contemplation is if somebody says, oh, I smoke a pack a day and I know it's wrong and I know it could cause me issues, but I'm just not quite there, doc, and I just need some time. That would be somebody who's in the contemplation phase. Preparation is saying, I know it's an issue. I'm going to quit. August 4th, that's the day. I'm set on it. I'm going to quit on August. Action is the actual act of the day when you are actually cutting out the cigarettes, throwing them out, whatever it is that you do. And the maintenance is the multi-month, multi-year, lifelong battle that is maintaining and avoiding the thing that you are addicted or struggling to. The thing I will say is that you can skip phases. This isn't a hard set rule. So you can go from maintenance and then let's say you have a bad night for whatever reason and you go back to the cigarette. You don't necessarily have to start all the way at the beginning and start denying that there are any benefits to quitting. You might jump back into preparation, for example, and you might say, I had a bad night last night, but tomorrow's the day I'm going to get back on that horse and I'm going to keep going. So this isn't a hard set rule, but this is a general pattern. And of course, you can skip phases. So ultimately, what I think people are probably thinking now is, what can I do? How can I help people? And again, this is a very difficult thing to work and manage. And I think that's why it's so important that we present or see our primary doctors or our mental health experts, is because this is a difficult thing to address. So myself as a primary doctor, we are trained and we work to never push people in any direction, at least in this concept when we're talking about addiction. So that is to say, if somebody told me my 95-year-old grandma was fine, so why should I quit? My job is not to tell people, oh, well, you might not be as lucky as her, you might die of lung cancer, so you need to quit right now. That's not my job, right? My job is to be supportive and recognize and make people recognize that this is something that's important, give them the resources, but my job and none of our job is to push people through these stages. That's not going to be effective for anybody, and that might just make them push further away from you as a supportive figure. So what we can do is be as compassionate and supportive as possible. Get them to their appointments or help somebody get to their appointments, give them resources, connect them with the right family or channels, give them guidance groups of support, and just make sure that they're aware that you know how difficult it is for them to be struggling, and not say things that might be counteractive, like just get over it or you need to stop, because there are so many, as we've seen, there's so many difficult barriers and obstacles that are in front of us when we're dealing with an addiction. So ultimately, my point for this is, make sure that we are graceful when we're dealing with people that are struggling with this, both with ourselves and with our family members and with people in our community. Sometimes that's hard to remember, and I think that's something that I think we can always do better. And I think for the most part, with the times and at least in my community, I've seen this improve so much, and I think we're all doing a really good job here. But there's always room to improve, and I think that's something that we need to keep in the forefront of our minds when we're talking about difficult topics like addiction. Alrighty. All right, so I said there was going to be a little bit of a spiritual takeaway at the end here, and I am going to deliver. All right, so if we remember the definition of addiction, it came up a few times. Ultimately, it is the urge to act or do something that ultimately impacts your life in some negative way. So the argument I'm going to make here is, if there is something that you may be addicted to or struggling to manage that is impacting your spiritual life, then it might be a spiritual issue. An example of that might be if you are drinking alcohol until 5 in the morning, you're at the bar, you didn't read the Bible last night, you didn't go to church in the morning, and you're having a struggle spiritually in that sense. That's when it definitely would be a spiritual issue. Now, the specific questions that people might ask are, is marijuana a sin? Is this a sin? Is that a sin? That's not really my place, and I would encourage you to speak to your spiritual guidance on those issues. But I'm just here to tell you the medical and the physiological and the social aspects. But the nuances of the spiritual aspect, I would leave to your spiritual leaders and guidance there. But I would argue almost certainly that if your addictions or your things that you're struggling with or your video games or whatever it may be is impacting your spiritual life, it is a spiritual problem, and you absolutely should reach out to somebody to get some resources and help spiritually. I'm going to leave off on a verse here, and then I will see if there are any questions or if I may have missed some in the chat. So I will read it real quick. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Resist him steadfast in faith, knowing that the same sufferings are experienced by your brotherhood in the world. But may the God of all grace, who called us to his eternal glory by Christ Jesus, after you have suffered a while, perfect, establish, strengthen, and settle you. To him be the glory and the dominion forever and ever. Amen. That's from the first epistle of Peter. Alrighty, that's all I have.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for the questions. Actually, there's one question from Burhan. He says on the chat, I'm wondering if there is a good addiction, such as reading a book.
Yeah, that's a great question. So that kind of ties into the very end of what I was kind of saying right there. So that might have been before I said what I said. But addiction in and of itself is always a bad thing because, like we said when we're talking about the definition, to be an addiction, it has to be something that's impacting your life. So if you read a lot of books and you're still going about your day, you're taking care of your day-to-day things, you're spending time with your family, and you only need to sleep 5 hours for whatever reason, that wouldn't be an addiction. Now, if you're not spending time with your family, you're not going and serving in the community, you're not doing the day-to-day things, and you're reading for 4 or 5 hours a day, that is an addiction, and that inherently is not a good thing. So the concept of addiction is typically when it is impacting or when it is negatively impacting. So for our definition and our purposes, addiction is always a negative thing because the definition is it's a negative thing. That's not to say that reading books is bad. That's not to say reading X number of books or X number of hours of books is bad. It's just to say that if the books are impacting your life, that's when we draw the line, and that's when it becomes an issue. Does that answer the question?
Thank you.
Yeah. So do you guys have any questions? So before they ask you, I have one question. This is like related to the video game. You said gambling is categorized as one of the kind of like alcohol or cigarette.
It's in that classification of addiction. Yeah, you got it.
Yeah, type of addiction. But there are gambling related videos,
Right.
especially for children. So and then sometimes those kids they may like them, So
So this is
yeah.
the big problem, which is these companies and these big companies are lobbying and fighting against the government and trying to qualify or state that this isn't technically gambling, and therefore there shouldn't be age verifications, there shouldn't be these restrictions in place because it isn't technically gambling. And that's where the laws are not keeping up with the virtual world. The virtual world is developing so quickly, and it's a bit of a gray area. So video games, or at least gambling and loot boxes and those types of things, right now aren't considered an addiction because the argument is they're not even gambling. And that's the thing that they're lobbying against and fighting to argue. But if you really look into it, or you really sit down and actually look into it, it's very clearly the exact same thing as just gambling real money, with just a couple extra steps to make it a little more inconspicuous. So if you are addicted to loot boxes or rolling crates or Candy Crush coins or whatever it is you're playing, then I would argue that that's the same thing as gambling. And then I would argue that that would fall under the category of an addiction if it's a habitual or chronic problem. But yeah, the issue is they're fighting the definition, which is the problem.
Yeah, gotcha. And then Helen, she put something on the chat.
Oh yeah, this is a tough one, and I got asked a very similar question. Is there a hard age or cutoff And there are no clear guidelines or times when you can start introducing technology to your children. And there aren't even very hard cutoffs in terms of screen time and how much time to give them access to the iPad. It's really a subjective thing. And it's something that you need to take case by case, see how your child or your family member is using those resources and how pervasive it is in their day and their time. Are they not paying attention when you're talking to them? Are they not going to volleyball practice or skipping morning swim practice or whatever it may be? That's where I would draw the line. That's where I would start to follow up, either try to limit their time or follow up with a primary or psychiatrist or behavioral therapist or whatever it may be, or counselor, to see how we can address that issue. But it's very case by case. There's no hard cutoff. There's no set time. And it's really just situational. If your child can hold an iPad at 5 and they just play for 20, 30 minutes and then they go to the park, great. That's fine. That's perfect. That's a good place to be in. But if they are not going to the park, they don't want to go see their friends, they don't want to eat their dinner because they're playing on the iPad and that's their iPad time, that's when it becomes an issue. And that's when you should probably either make some changes or seek additional resources and help. But again, there's no hard cutoff there, to my knowledge.
I have a question, Dr. Anthony. So, about the video games, some parents, they allow their children to play video game because it will be helpful. They become smart, knowledgeable with technology, computer, whatever. So how we can compare for those who allow them to play games to be smart in mathematics, whatever, for those not have any practice?
I gotcha. Yeah. So there are actually a lot of studies that show people who grew up playing video games have better hand-eye coordination, better problem-solving skills. There are a lot of benefits to video games. Nothing we've talked about today is saying that in moderation that it's a bad thing, right? You always hear that classic concept of red wine at night is healthy versus not healthy. Every day it changes. But in and of itself, none of these things, including video games, are a bad thing. You can play video games, with your friends. It's a great way to socialize, to create social networks. So video games in of itself is not the problem. The problem is when it starts to impact your day-to-day life. I'll give you an example. I had a friend who play video games with, and then when I was in university, I would go to class, and he wouldn't go to class. He would still be on the game. And I'd come home after studying and doing what I need to do, and he'd still be online. And he ultimately failed, dropped out, and that's when it's a problem, right? But the opposite side being, if you're still going to class and doing everything, that's a good thing. So what I would say, I mean, this is my personal opinion, and this is because I play video games, so I might be a little biased, but I think if you can introduce it in a safe and effective way, there's no harm in introducing video games to your children and making sure that they're being regulated and monitored. But if they're playing in an hour or two here and there and they still go about their life and day to day, I personally don't see an issue with it. I think you need to just be very hyper aware of if that line is being crossed. If they're starting to lose either their social time or their family time or their ability to function and socialize and interact with their community. That's where I would draw the line. But I think just inherently, I don't think video games an hour here and there, and if they're still doing all their day-to-day stuff, is necessarily an issue. And it can actually have a lot of positive impacts, like I mentioned.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. So it's almost at 5:10, and maybe we can wait a little bit for 5 minutes. Is that okay with you? And then
Yeah.
and then I think after that we can close it because the time was just like a 1 hour.
Yeah, sorry, I went
We
over.
have to no, we have to respect your time. No, I'm just we have to respect your time. And then
No.
there's a question from Razana. He said this on the chat says, how does exposure to addiction at an early age cause mental health issues?
So the opposite is true, where if you already have mental health issues, you're more prone to getting an addiction. Like we mentioned earlier, if you're struggling with your mental health, let's say you are always down, depressed, you might turn to substances that ultimately lead to an addiction. In general, mental health issues are very hand in hand. People who have one mental health issue are at a significantly increased chance of having multiple. So everything just kind of compounds on everything. And if you start early, you're more likely to become addicted, and then that can or cannot lead to other mental health issues. The exact cause of being, let's say, addicted to alcohol and ultimately leading to depression is a bit unclear. And that would be a great talk that I could give about mental health in terms of addiction, anxiety, and those things. Sorry, depression, anxiety, and those things. But just a quick summary of those talks. Ultimately, we don't have a clear explanation why some people are depressed and some people aren't, and some people have anxiety and some people don't. There are a lot of factors that go into it, including substance abuse, but the exact mechanism and what leads somebody to that path or dealing with that mental health issue is not well understood. But we do know there's a lot of correlation and a lot of people who have one are more likely to be affected by it.
Great. I think Helen one is maybe a comment. I know, is that a question? It looked like a comment to me.
Oh, the contract one?
Yes, I do on having kids sign contract before exposure to technology. Maybe if you want
Yeah,
to buy them a cell, you just have to give them.
contracts, at least in my experience and in the medical community's thoughts, are not really effective, especially when we're dealing with mental health issues. Because contracts in and of themselves are great when you're not struggling with something, but once you begin to struggle with something, the contract won't, at least in my experience and what I've been trained to do, is it doesn't really hold up. And it doesn't actually address the problem, right? If it works for specific children or family members, great. But like I said, it's a lifelong battle. It's a struggle. It's a obstacle once you're struggling with an addiction. And there is no one cookie cutter solves all problems. It's really, really situational. And I would say it's probably better to talk to your primary or your psychiatrist or mental health expert before you start initiating contracts or putting them in difficult situations, because that might actually cause more distress to the person if they are struggling or failing or not meeting their goals, or those stressors, which is why I kind of wanted to focus more on being supportive and available for somebody and not so much being critical or pointing out their mistakes, because if and when someone fails a contract, that might cause more anxiety, more stress, and more issues. But again, it's very situational. It might work for some people over others. It might be a good way to prevent somebody from becoming addicted. There are definitely a lot of circumstances, and it's hard to answer that question with a yes or no, but those are just my thoughts.
Okay, I can take one more question, and then after that, I think we let's see. Any question for Dr. Messiah?
Sorry, can I ask one question? Thank you so much.
Yeah, go ahead, Ellen.
Sorry. Okay. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the talk. It's nice to hear it. I guess it was just more kind of in line of the, definitely I know, like you were saying, it's good to show grace and important to show grace, but just that thought of like, I guess, what is it? The phrase is like an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of treatment. Like, I guess, what can we do on the front end to kind of prevent some of these things from happening? Like, is it helpful to sort of have these other more healthy ways of getting that dopamine high that can help kind of protect, our kids or our loved ones from having to feel the need to turn to substances to self-medicate?
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely a really good takeaway, is trying to catch things before they develop. And then that's a lot easier to do and has a lot more impact than, say, trying to play catch up at the end of things, just like all chronic illnesses, right? Or all chronic diseases. So what I would say is, if you can focus more on monitoring and being present for people who are under the age of 21, people who are still developing, that's probably the most impactful thing you can do. So for instance, like we mentioned with the video games, now that we're aware about things like loot boxes and crates and types of gambling in that sense, now that we're aware of it, we might sit with our children and monitor how they're using those virtual purchases and making sure that they're getting the things that they intended to purchase. So I think just being present and aware and monitoring where and what our children are doing is probably the most impactful thing that we can do to help mitigate and prevent the development of addictions in general. But again, these are all risk factors. And just like depression, just like anxiety, just like all mental health issues, sometimes it's not something we do or don't do. Sometimes it just is a scenario that we're handed and we have to make the most of it. Just like people with high blood pressure. A lot of the times we never really find a clear explanation, but we just do with what we have and we do the best that we can. So not being hard on ourselves or thinking that we did something wrong or that we could have been more supportive or we could have been more preventative. Sometimes it's not that clear of an explanation. And ultimately what I'd say is the most impactful thing we can do is monitoring and being present for people of early onset ages, because that's when you can be the most impactful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, great. It's almost, it's 5:18, almost 5:20. Thank you so much. This was just, it's very insightful and helpful. And what we're gonna do is, these are already recording the video, and then we're gonna post on our YouTube, and then other members of our community also should be able to see it. And then also we're gonna give you the link to you. Just I want to thank you for, on the behalf of the Eritrean Assistance Organization in Chicago, for sharing your time. It's professional advice and experts with us. It's amazing. Thank you so much. Your your insights are valuable to us. So we are grateful for your willingness, to share them with us once again. Thank you so much. And then, yeah, thank you.
Of course, of course.
Other
Thank you so
members
much.
also, if you have, you can, give your thank you message. So thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Dr.
course.
Anthony.
Take care, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Anthony. It was very helpful. God bless you. Thank you.
God bless. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.